good news of Jesus Christ according to Luke. We're back in Luke today. And we're going to be in chapter 18, and I'm going to start reading at verse 9 this morning. And this is the next parable that Jesus, the last few Sundays, we've seen that Jesus has been teaching in some parables. And we've seen that there's been kind of a theme about faith and about the opposite of faith, sin. And then we talked about what that means. But today we're going to be venturing into something else. Now, a lot of the sayings and parables of Jesus, they make us feel good. They encourage us. But yet there are also some parables and teachings of Jesus that make us uncomfortable. They make us put a mirror up to ourselves. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's not so good. So I guess this is your warning, your pre-warning, that this is going to be one of those parables. And we're going to take a look here at what Jesus is talking about. He's going to compare that Pharisee to that tax collector. And let's see what we can make out of this parable this morning. Again, I'm in chapter 18. I'm going to start at verse 9 and read through verse 14. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Amen. I noticed on Facebook that some of my friends who are still in school, still in seminary, and a lot of my college-age people that I know, this is that time of year where everybody seems they got finished with midterms. Those of you who went to college, you remember your midterms? They aren't exactly finals, but there's still just as much stress involved with your midterms. And I remember, I really had some stress because I went back to seminary. I was 40 years old when I went to seminary. It had been a long time since I sat in a college class. And those midterms in seminary, there wasn't any multiple choice tests, okay? They were all what we used to call in high school those essay tests. And they wanted to know what you thought. They want to know what you remembered. They want to know what you thought about it. And I remember, it seems like I went to seminary with a whole bunch of overachievers because they always were more prepared and ready to take their tests. And all of them wanted to know, people I went to school with, they all wanted to know, oh, how do you think you did on so-and-so's midterm and all that. And I finally realized that when being in seminary and taking those kind of tests, I really was never wrong. I knew the answer, but my grade always depended on how right I really was. You know what I mean? I mean, you knew what you wanted to say. You knew who did it, who did the basics. But you never knew for sure how much more information that professor needed to hear from you to make it an A. And so I just always said this. I don't know. I was right. I just don't know how much. Well, that's what we're really talking about here. We're talking about how we grade, how we judge, the standards we use. Because, we can all think we're a really good person based on whose standards? On our own standards, right? I mean, we're basically judging ourselves by what we think makes a good person. And then I'm going to look at you and use that same standard on whether I think you're a good person, or a productive person, or an evil person, or whatever kind of person. Whose really standard am I using? I'm using my own. And, when I was researching this sermon and figuring out what we're going to talk about, the emphasis today, and that there really is some multiple standards on which we judge, I found this story about a guy arrested for armed robbery in 1992 in Rapid City, South Dakota. And when the police arrested him, they found in his wallet his standard. Now, and I bring this up because I want to show you how everybody has their own standard. I want you to compare your standard to this armed robber standard, okay? He has 8 points for living, how he wants to live his life by. So think about your standard for living and see how this compares. Number 1 on his list, I will not kill anyone unless I have to. Number 2, I will take cash and food stamps, no checks. I will rob only at night. I will not wear a mask. I will not rob mini marts or 7-Elevens. If chased, I will not put the lives of innocent civilians on the line. I like that one. I will rob only 7 months out of the year. And the last one, I will enjoy robbing from the rich to give to the poor. That's his standard. His idea to live by. How's that compare to your standards? Is he being a good person or just a good armed robber? I mean, that's what we have to decide. But that's really what we're looking at, because our standard will determine this really fancy church word that Jesus used at the beginning of this parable. He said, there are people who trust in themselves and get their righteousness from them. That's that fancy word. Well, righteousness is simply this. It is a state of being right or good according to a certain standard. So as long as that armed robber lives by his standard, we can use that R word. He's righteous because he was following in line. If my answers are correct for an A on my old seminary test, then I would be righteous based on that standard. Now, we've had some fun at the expense of this guy that got arrested, but in reality, standards are not usually very funny when they don't match up. Just today, in a news event that was reported yesterday, talked about a judge in Helena, Montana, who was before a court case of rape. And the public is outraged because the criminal, the man accused of rape, was not given any prison time. And the judge said, I can do that. Now, you don't understand the full story, because this man that was accused and convicted of rape was a man who raped his own 12-year-old daughter. And the public wants answers. And this is what the judge said in his decision. The sentence may not be a popular decision by certain members of the general public, but it is a just and proper decision given the record before the court and the law the court is sworn to uphold. In other words, I am righteous in the standards I am using, even though they don't measure up to your standards. Does that surprise you? Does that shock you? Does that make you go, now wait a minute, there's supposed to be certain standards we go by? You're right. But this is what we're talking about. This is the story of the parable. This is the Pharisee who went in to pray at church, and he said, God, thank you that I am not like the rest of these people. That I actually do what I'm supposed to do. I fast twice a week. I tithe to the church. That's what I'm supposed to do. I'm just glad I'm not like this tax collector over here. How miserable is he? That Pharisee was judging himself based on a standard. The standard of the world. And if we would be lying if we said we never judged ourselves next to somebody else. Well, at least I'm good. I'm a really good person because look at what he does. Look what he doesn't do. We all do that. But that's the standard of the world. How our actions are judged comes from that idea that as long as I'm better than some other people, I'm okay. How many times have you heard that from people in the world? Hey, do you think you're going to go to heaven when you die? Oh, yeah. I'm a pretty good guy. I hold doors for people. I pay it forward at Starbucks every once in a while. I say hello. I go to church occasionally. That's got to put me in there because I'm a really good person. That's being judged by our own standard, and that standard usually comes from what the world says is a good person. But that tax collector, he stood there, and we don't know this, by the way. We don't know whether that tax collector tithed to the church. We don't know whether that tax collector went to church every Sunday or once a month or never. We don't know whether that tax collector held people's doors open for them or said hello to each other or left big tips or any of that kind of stuff. We don't know that. All it says is that when he came before the Lord, he broke down and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, the message that normally you get from this parable is clear, isn't it? Just what I told the children. If we're going to measure ourselves on how we're doing, we don't need to measure ourselves compared to each other. We're supposed to measure ourselves as Christians to the life of Jesus Christ. And a lot of people say, well, come on, preacher, I can't do that. Nobody's perfect. Jesus was perfect. I can't do all that. But that's the measuring stick. And it's how we react that's really the big difference. And I could end right here and say the message for us today is simple. We do not need to measure how we're doing compared to each other or to the world. Our actions need to be judged on next to Jesus Christ. Standing in the light of the risen Savior, how are we doing? And that's bad enough. But that's not really what the parable is saying. Because we really don't know what that taxpayer has been doing. We don't know his actions at all. You see, this parable is not about how we judge our actions or your actions or anybody else's actions. Because quite frankly, I think this parable tells us that God doesn't judge us on our actions at all. God is judging these two gentlemen, not on what they do or don't do. God is judging them and saying that the tax collector, the so-called rogue or bad kid, he's being rewarded. He is receiving his righteousness. He is justifying his life as he returns home. Are we supposed to just say, God, have mercy on me? That only works if we believe it. Because here's the real solution. Here's the real meaning of this parable. It's not about God judging our actions. It's about God judging our hearts. That's the difference between these two men. The Pharisee judged himself by the world. He didn't love anybody and he didn't really love God. And he said, I'm doing okay compared to everybody else. But the tax collector came into the presence of God and realized he has not loved as God has loved. Now, how are we doing? You know, because we can be nice to each other in public, right? We can put on that action. I can make you think I'm your best friend out in the world. But if I do not love you in my heart, or if I go home and I tell Judy, boy, that guy drives me crazy. Think about it. When was the last time, not in public, but in private, maybe to a friend, maybe to yourself, you said, boy, that guy's an idiot. I know, I've been there. That's what God is judging. That's what this story is about. Because when we find out that we're nowhere close to loving people like God calls us to love others and to love Him, the only response can be, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Because He doesn't care how we act, because if our love is right, our actions will be true. We don't need a code of conduct. We need a God that's our God, a God of love, a God we love. Because if we love God as our God, our actions will change forever. See, that's what that parable is about. The standard of judgment isn't about actions at all. It's about how we love and how we don't love. You see, I don't believe that you can't say, I can't be perfect like Jesus was. God expects us to be perfect like Jesus was. Not in our actions, but in our love. God is perfect in His love for us, and He expects us to be perfect in our love for Him. It doesn't come overnight, but He expects that to happen. And when we love Him with more and more of our heart, we will actually love each other more and more with our heart, even the guy I called an idiot. Because then it doesn't matter. That's That's why this is such a mirror type of passage, that mirror in front of us, because it takes a real hard look, because I can act really righteous. But God's not fooled by what you see. God only knows what he sees, how we love and don't love. And that's where the mirror gets real frightening. Because if you look at my life, you look at it at a video of it, or any of us, that guy's a good guy. What a neat man. He is such a nice person. Luckily, they have not made an X-ray machine that shows what's going on in here. And because of that, there's nothing left to say when we really get down to it. When we come to the church to pray, God asks us, how's that love going? How are you doing loving me and loving others? We can't stand up and say, man, I'm doing it all right. I give to the church, I do all that. Our Lord's Acre is better than their Lord's Acre. We brought in more. We did more. That's the Pharisee in us. The reason that was such a blessing is because of the other. What are we going to do it for? What do we do any of this for? Is it so that people will think we're just incredible? Or that we can fall more and more in love with God? Fall more and more in love with each other? To fall more and more into the perfection that God expects? No. It's time. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Amen. I'd like to invite you into a time of prayer.